Hello, my name is Justin Hardman. I'm joining you today from Shanghai, China, where I'm just here for a quick trip. Normally based in Hong Kong. I'm the founder and director of 21st Century Learning, and it's my job here just to quickly introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Simon Probert from the Harrow School in Shanghai, who is the deputy head for standards. And I'm very excited to hear his session today on culturally responsive leadership in an East Asian cultural context. As with all of these live streams, this will be available as a recording later. We'll share the slides and everything out. If you have questions during the session, please feel free to drop those in the chat. If you're joining from X or a platform that doesn't support that, then just jump on one of the other streams that we offer and you can join and participate. With that, I would like to hand it over to Simon and see you on the other side, Simon.
Thank you, Justin. Lovely to meet everyone on this sunny, rather crisp day here in Shanghai. So it's my pleasure this afternoon really to chat through some ideas really that stemmed through my doctoral research, which was examining student and school leader perceptions of internationalism in international schools in mainland China. From that, though, grew an interest much more broadly in thinking and reflecting on this theme of leadership, and specifically, as I'll be discussing today, culturally responsive leadership. I guess during my journey in international education, I've been out in East Asia now for going on, 15, 20 years. I've become increasingly aware of, firstly, ways in which obviously the culture in China, culture in East Asia is very different to my own culture. I grew up in kind of rural Oxfordshire in the UK, but equally ways in which as leaders we bring our own kind of baggage, our own cultural backgrounds to leadership. The role of personality in leadership. Indeed, I'm really interested in the theme of stories. And ways as leaders we bring our own stories and perspectives, hopefully to enrich the multifaceted and diverse contexts that we work in as international educators. I'm going to speak today for around 40 minutes and then happy to take any questions. I'm going to start really by talking about why I see this as both a pertinent area, an important area for us to reflect upon as leaders in international schools in East Asia, but also an area that I think can be problematic for us as you know, we encounter cultural contexts which may be very different from our own. I'm then going to kind of reflect upon approaches to leadership in cross-cultural contexts, this notion of being culturally responsive, what that might look like, and what that might mean. And then finally, I'm going to propose a model which I published a paper on in December, which is looking much more specifically at this idea of leadership in a Confucian kind of cultural context. This link to China, but also I hope more broadly to East Asia. So this is an area that I've been reflecting upon a lot, particularly in the past year or so. So starting with ways we think about rituals and habits. I mean, I think eating is a cultural activity. As I said, I grew up in rural England, and I remember as a child, my grandparents were very fastidious about table manners. And I can remember being told the orders of knives and forks at the table, how to wear a napkin properly, not having your elbows on the table. And we spent years at this as children, and we finally graduated. We were promised we would graduate to a restaurant. We graduated to McDonald's. So I'm not sure that tells you about my table manners as a child. Equally in China, eating is very much a cultural activity. My wife is Chinese. My children, who are 8 and 9, are growing up in a bicultural context, which I think is fantastic. And when I go to Chinese meals, the big round table, I still am looked on with a sense of despair, I think, as I struggle to debone my fish with chopsticks. Teaching, I think, is also in many ways a cultural activity. Reflecting on ways that teaching in a Chinese cultural context, you go into local schools. I've been privileged enough to visit lots of local schools, it looks very different to teaching and learning, certainly in a British or in the Western cultural context. The images we often see when it comes to Gaokao, to the university prep season of students with textbooks kind of knee high on their desks. Students have to sit with their arms folded, listening to the teacher. Very different way of teaching and learning to in a British or indeed a Westernized cultural context. Equally, I think that leadership is a cultural activity. There are many different styles of leadership. When I came across Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence and ways we adapt our leadership to the context in which we find ourselves, I found that fascinating. But equally, I think there are many shades and tones of leadership, in the sense that leadership in a UK cultural setting is different to leadership in an American cultural setting, reflecting on differences in the office in the UK versus America. And equally, as we'd therefore expect, there are significant cultural differences to leadership in a UK cultural context, to leadership in an East Asian cultural context. And I think that's a really useful way to start when we think about leadership in international schools, and specifically the way we work with the diverse range of cultures and communities, individuals who we're working with in our roles. So I really like this paper here. So I don't know if anyone who's read in the area that I did my thesis in would probably have come across Tristan Bunnell, who was my doctoral supervisor, and also Alex Gardner McTaggart. So they wrote this paper that I really enjoyed in 2022, where they talked about this idea of the Anglo-Saxon leadership mobility. By that, they were talking about leaders in international schools, particularly people like me, acknowledging my own positionality as a white male or British international school leader. But more broadly, ways in which leaders from Westernized contexts often don't take the time, and perhaps they don't have the interest or the motivation to really engage with the cultural context in which they find themselves. Mindful of the massive growth of the international school sector, the dynamism, something I get really excited about, of the sector, and equally the move to local students rather than third culture kids as the demographic or the largest demographic in most certainly newer international schools in East Asia. So they talk about ways in which we bring our kind of Western frameworks, Westernized ideas, perhaps our own preconceptions about leadership, about what leadership looks like, to our context, rather than stepping back and taking the time to listen, and really understand in a deeper, more thorough way the cultural context in which we find ourselves. A couple of years ago, I published a paper and I talked about imaginary maps, thinking from a curriculum perspective, and ways we often bring Westernized frameworks into very different cultural contexts in terms of curriculum, for example, in our approach to the humanities or literature. Similarly, I think with leadership, there's often a danger we're bringing Westernized understandings, Westernized conceptions of what leadership looks like to contexts in which that's not necessarily, completely appropriate. I'm really interested in culture. This is something, and indeed identity. These are both key themes which kind of emerged through the work I was doing on my doctorate. I'm sure many of us have come across Erin Mayer's The Culture Map, or indeed Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, which before I go on to talk about a bit more and perhaps critique, I do think are useful ways into beginning to reflect upon cultural difference. So if you haven't come across Hofstede, Hofstede did some research at IBM in the 1960s and 1970s of, I guess, the cultural perceptions and understandings of people from, all across the world. And he originally came up with 5 of what he called cultural dimensions. He then came up with a 6th, exclusively working with individuals from a Chinese cultural background in the 1990s. And you can see those there in front of you on the screen. Of course, these may be useful ways for us to generalize, and to reflect upon cultural difference. But at the same time, I think they can be problematic. So, for example, even though China is much less individualistic, i.e. far more collectivist, according to Hofstede, than America, Germany, or indeed the UK, where I'm from, was it on there. The Chinese education system is profoundly individualistic. Chinese schools are profoundly competitive. And I think clearly that's challenging the way in which Hofstede may have thought about culture. Equally, thinking about uncertainty avoidance, so the tolerance for risk. According to Hofstede, in China, there was a very low tolerance for risk relative to the West. Having said that, I think there's been significant generational shift in China. And I think that younger people actually have a much higher tolerance for risk than the older generation. So I guess what I'm getting at is that although this might be a useful way of thinking about culture, at the same time, we need to be careful in ways in which we generalize about culture, and specifically ways we think about cultural difference. I came across the work of Hartmut Rosa recently. He's published a couple of wonderful books which are translated to English. I don't read German. And I'm going to come onto another one actually right at the end of this presentation. So this is a book he published in, I think, it's translated in 2022. Called The Uncontrollability of the World. And I'm just going to read what he says here, because I think it fascinates me and it really excites me. So he writes, the driving cultural force of that form of life we call modern is the idea, the hope, the desire that we can make the word controllable. Yet it is only in encountering the uncontrollable that we really experience the world. Only then do we feel touched, moved, alive. That sense of experience is, I think, fascinating and exciting. And for me, to really understand a culture, we can look from the outside in. Maybe we can understand some elements from the outside in, but in reality, to understand a culture, you have to experience it. And I would really agree with Hartmut Rosa here, albeit he's talking much more broadly about the world, very broadly defined. There is something inherently uncontrollable about culture. There is something that we can't capture, perhaps, in words, and we certainly can't categorize, which is ultimately would be one of my frustrations with Hofstede's approach. This sense that to really understand culture, we have to experience it. Only then do we feel touched, moved, alive, I think is a useful way of thinking about and reflecting on culture, and certainly the sense of cultural difference. We work in really exciting contexts, and I'm sure it's the case for everyone here. I think every day, as international educators, we come across experiences which challenge us. They make us think in new and exciting ways. I can, very much changed as a leader in the leadership journey that I've been on in the past 15 or so years. So specifically thinking about international schools in China, which was the focus of my doctoral research, I tried to articulate, I suppose, the challenge of working in China and international school contexts by thinking about these three categories, which were articulated in a paper published by Jeff Thompson, who's at the University of Bath back in 1998. So he talks about the importance of cultural diversity, a balanced curriculum, and administrative styles. So cultural diversity in terms of the global values and the local values. Indeed, I'm constantly, I suppose, there's a sense that these are the values, that this is now how we're thinking about global citizenship, the sense on the global and the local. And it's something that I'm constantly seeing, in terms of the research on schools, and I think also in terms of the way schools are thinking about themselves. The sense of balanced curriculum. So I talked earlier about the fact my doctoral research had focused particularly on curriculum. So the importance of links between subjects, within subjects, the hidden curriculum and the pastoral curriculum. And most importantly of all, as Alexander Gardner McTaggart wrote in an earlier paper in 2018, it's the leaders of international schools, who, and as we're all aware, as leaders, who are really setting the tone and the values of those communities. And at the core of administrative styles and how we lead is the importance of communication and dialogue, and listening. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about, hopefully for the next 25 minutes or so. On that note, and again, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. So this is Gamston and Wellman, and they write, the patterns of adult interaction in a school strongly influence the climate and instructional outcomes for students. As leaders, we have this strong sense of moral prerogative to model the behaviours amongst ourselves that we expect to see with students. I was chatting in assembly this week about social media and habits with phones. And then I was chatting in staff briefing about how important it is we model the same values as educators that we expect our students to follow. Because ultimately, we are role models for our students, and ways that we frame and think about leadership as adults will affect the ways that our students think and reflect on the same kind of context, concepts, and the role of culture. I also really like this. So this is Paul and Adam Paul, who's prolific. He's published loads of really interesting papers and a couple of books actually on education in China, which I'd really recommend. So they published a paper in 2022 in which they talked about 3 metaphors for international education. I'm going to come on to the third metaphor right at the end of today's presentation. But the first 2 metaphors are decoupling and diluting. So they're writing about ways in which Chinese international schools, specifically bilingual schools actually in China, differ from earlier models of international education in China. But I also think they're a useful way to think about leadership and to reflect on ourselves as leaders. In what senses are we decoupled from leaders from different cultural contexts, particularly local cultural contexts, who we might be working with? Or I suppose equally, in what senses perhaps are we finding ourselves decoupled from our own values, our own beliefs as leaders, which of course it's very important that we have in terms of this sense of being authentic in our approaches and understandings of leadership. In what ways are ways in which we lead, or perhaps our values diluted? In what ways do we find ourselves making compromises that perhaps we didn't want to make? In what ways are we letting things go by the by because we don't have perhaps the energy, the cultural understanding, the motivation to either challenge them or actually to think about ways they might resonate with our own cultural values? Equally, I often put up, I've presented a couple of times broadly on this theme of culture, Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Ballad of East and West. These broad categories of East and West. Again, it's been interesting just listening into the conversation being had by international educators in the region the past couple of years, and the emphasis much more being on the East and ways in which actually our values are much more centered and based on the East. My problem is not with that. It's with the fact that I think the notions of the East and the West are vast generalizations, and we need to be much more specific and reflective when we talk and we think about what we mean by culture. This is Burgess 2023. So what I'm getting at, and I'm coming towards the end now of this first section, is the sense that I think it's easy to make blinkered assumptions. It's easy to be simplistic, to be uninformed when we think about culture. It's easier not to acknowledge the complexity of the cultures in which we find ourselves. That sense perhaps of difference to the culture that we come from, but equally of synergy. One of my issues with the term East and West is that these are both ultimately relatively modern terms. And actually, if you go back in time 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, you see far more synergy between the so-called West and the so-called East. And these were terms that were not used in the same way they are today. I think to promote a sense of division and difference rather than one of commonality, which I would argue is so important to us as international educators. So the difference between cognitive empathy and cognitive dissonance. I think working internationally, when I talk about this sense of challenge, when I reflect on myself and ways in which I am challenged on a daily basis, both by maybe the different cultural contexts that I see in school, but also those outside of school, this sense of cognitive dissonance can be very real. When I see behaviors that perhaps are different to what I might have expected, To what extent over the years have I developed a sense of cognitive empathy? I've spent a long time in China. To some extent, I have obviously a far stronger sense and understanding of Chinese culture than I did when I first came to China back in 2008, just because I was fascinated by ways it was different to the UK and to the context which I was used to. But at the same time, Chinese culture, any culture, is monolithic. And I will come back to this point that to really understand the culture, you have to experience it. My understanding of China, my sense of Chinese culture will never be the same as that of my wife, who's Chinese, who grew up here, who's obviously can speak fluent Mandarin and also fluent Shanghainese. And that's something, again, that I think it's important to be mindful of. So I've talked in this first section about, I think, some of the challenges of leading in international schools. I've also talked about ways in which we find ourselves in cultural contexts which are both very different to our own, but actually the importance of reflecting on and thinking about synergy. Where are the commonalities, and how can we use those differences to be much better at what we do? And that is what I'm going to move on to now for the next 10 or so minutes. So I wrote this paper, which I published in December, on this idea of culturally responsive leadership. To be honest, when I started writing it, I liked the term culturally responsive because it describes what I thought I was talking about and thinking about, but I hadn't really thought in any detail actually about what this term culturally responsive meant, or indeed the literature around it. And what I came across was there's a lot of really interesting literature which challenged me, actually, in terms of culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive education, which was predominantly literature talking about education in North America, thinking about working with students from, I suppose, non-white cultural contexts. This is Ladson Billing, who's, again, been very prolific on this area, about culturally responsive as referring to a more dynamic or synergistic relationship between the home culture and the school culture. I think we often forget, as expatriate educators, ways in which the working environment, our school environments, are very different to the home environments of not only many of our students, particularly if they come from local cultural backgrounds, but equally of many of our staff. On our leadership twilight sessions, which is run by our middle leaders this week, one of our leaders, who is Chinese Australian, was talking about her sense of living in two very different cultural spheres. And I suppose I'm interested in ways we can bring those spheres together. Again, this sense of synergy and togetherness rather than difference. And equally, I think this is a very under-researched area. We all understand as leaders the importance of trust, but there are very few studies out there in any context on ways in which trust develops in settings where racial, gender, and ethnic disparities are a focal concern, in areas where you have people from diverse cultural contexts, from a range of different backgrounds coming together, and how you can bring those people together to ensure that you are thriving, you are working, in that culture of trust. And as I say, obviously the ethos that we create as leadership teams in our schools will very much model ways in which the students behave and think in our communities. So beginning to think about kind of frameworks which do exist for thinking about this area. So on the left here, I've just put up the cultural intelligence scale. So I mentioned earlier today Daniel Goleman and emotional intelligence. Wonderful. If you haven't read it, I think it's on the bookcase behind me, actually, for thinking about the importance of us as leaders being self-aware, aware of our strengths and also our vulnerabilities, and how that might affect the relationships that we have with the people that we lead and work with. But earlier in Ang 2003, they talk about cultural intelligence. So ways in which being informed by culture helps us to approach leadership. So the importance of metacognitive CQ, being aware of this sense of cultural knowledge and adjusting it to different audiences. The importance of cognitive CQ, so knowing that the rules, the values, the arts and crafts, having an understanding of the culture, the cultural context in which we find ourselves. Motivational CQ, I think I find this the most challenging. So in their paper, they talk about ways that the more leaders change context, or more people, so they're writing about individuals rather than leaders, the more people change context, the less motivated they are actually to learn about this new cultural context in which we find. And ways, I would hope that as staff coming to live in a very different cultural context, that motivation would be innate. But I'm aware we're very busy people. It would be great if learning Mandarin was quick and easy, because that's obviously a great way into understanding Chinese culture. But finding ways to motivate our staff and to be interested as leaders, personally as well, in local culture, I think that's really, really important. And finally, behavioural CQ. Obviously, body language is different across cultures. Being aware of differences in body language, the importance of face in an East Asian cultural context. Something for me personally to think about, ways I vary the rate of my speaking. I'm a very fast speaker, as you may have picked up when I'm working with people from different cultural contexts who may not be native speakers of English. And then this paper was further developed by Al Dahiri. He was looking at schools in the Emirates and thinking about leadership specifically. So CQ in terms of strategy, knowledge, motivation, and behaviour. I'm going to come back to that in about 10 minutes' time when I talk about my own model and my own way of thinking about what this can look like in our rich and diverse cultural contexts in East Asia. Equally, I'd say I'm British, and most of my reading around leadership has been around more Westernised models around leadership and educational leadership. See, Michael Fullan, fantastic. If you hadn't come across him, he's probably my go-to when I think about educational leadership. Just thinking about ways in which he talks about educational leadership. So this is a model which I took off his website, I think, last year, which I think summarizes a lot of his thinking. So he talks about the importance of capacity, ways in which we grow capacity and invest in capacity as leaders. Leadership at all levels. So thinking about ways in which we invest in all of our staff as leaders at different levels of leadership. The importance of engagement and cultivation, and finally, the importance of the moral imperative. As teachers, as educators, we have this strong sense of vocation. We do what we do because we believe what we want to, and we believe we are having a positive impact on the lives and the futures and the aspirations of the young people who we work with. Very central to Michael Fullan's work on leadership, and something that is absolutely, I think, our North Star as international educators. There's less leadership out there on leadership in a Confucian cultural context, which is really what I focused on when I thought about leadership in China, but hopefully as well that this resonates more broadly in East Asia. I also taught in South Korea, 10 or so years ago now. So Yang et al. 2020, they write about thinking about Confucianism, the importance of doing the right thing, which I think the moral imperative, the importance of developing others by cultivating yourself, thinking back to this sense of emotional intelligence. We start with ourselves. We start by being self-aware. We start by being reflective, aligning knowing with doing. The importance of leading by example. We're out there. We're visible. We're approachable. We're seen to be doing things and having an impact. Balance, thinking about Taoism as well, actually, and the yin and the yang, and ways as leaders we can show that balance, perhaps between our own cultural context, which we grew up in, and the context in which we find ourselves, and of course the importance of empathy, of wanting to understand, of listening, and hopefully of succeeding in at least partially understanding the diverse and complexity of the communities and the many individuals who we're privileged to work with as educators. And again, this sense of ethical leadership. Again, I've been very struck by, I think this is a term that, again, I'm seeing more and more, on social media and in terms of my own networks, in ways we're thinking about and defining leadership in our, in our schools. So again, thinking about Confucianism, the importance of E. So if you spend time in China, you will see. If you come to China, fantastic China, culturally absolutely fascinating. But you will see lots of big character posters, which are often slogans. And often you will see these characters because they are deeply embedded in Chinese culture and Chinese philosophy, and ways I think China, often talks and thinks, about ways forward. But equally, they are deeply embedded in Confucianism and Confucian values and leadership. So E as righteousness, and Li as rights. So rights as kind of the lived events, the lived activities of a culture. Assemblies, lunchtimes. These are key rites and rituals of school life. Really interesting to think about these, about ways in a Confucian cultural context they think about rituals and rites. The importance of De. So De is a character which really underpins, I guess, Confucianism. It's very central as well in the literature around Chinese education and the Chinese curriculum, about kindness, favor, and gracious treatment. Again, Confucius talks about this sense of leadership and virtue, and the sense of the North Star. Us having this aspiration, this vision, these areas that we're working towards as leaders in international schools. Guan, so it's about care and compassion for other people, thinking about empathy. Ren, so this term is about kindness and benevolence. And finally, Junzi. So Junzi encapsulates, in more patriarchal culture, so it translates as a gentleman, but I think much more broadly than that, it encapsulates the importance of care, of leading by example, of concern, and of being committed to doing the right thing. And again, for me, it's really useful to refer and think back to actually, what are the cultural expectations in the cultural context in which we're finding ourselves? What do they mean to us, and the leadership and the values of the schools in which we're operating? Okay, so going back to Al-Dahiri's model earlier, thinking as I move into the final stage of my presentation now, thinking about explicitly leadership in a Confucian context, leadership in the East Asian context in which we find ourselves, the importance of strategy. Strategy is about guan, it's about care, it's about being committed, it's about planning and thinking ahead in both the medium term and the longer term. The importance of cultural knowledge. I've linked that to this sense of rights. Rights and rituals kind of underpin everything. When we think about non-verbal behaviors, the behaviors that we exhibit when we first meet and greet someone, the behaviors in meetings, so both formal and informal contexts, and ways they're informed by our cultural knowledge, because they do play a very central role in the life of schools. Schools are places that have lots of their own traditions, lots of their own rituals. Thinking back to teaching as a cultural activity and the many rituals, standing up outside a classroom, giving out books, that cold calling or putting hands up, the rites and rituals that actually underpin, a given lesson. Motivation. So the sense of righteousness, the moral imperative. For me, it's really important that we're motivated to want to learn about the cultural context in which we find ourselves. Obviously, that has to link to capacity. I've already alluded to the difficulty of learning Mandarin, and clearly it's not a possibility for most of us to develop fluent Mandarin, even if we spend a significant amount of time in China. But just showing an interest in the language, showing an interest in the food, showing interest in the culture. China's a fantastic place to travel. I've traveled a lot in China, not least because I was stranded in Beijing during COVID. But that sense of the importance of us being motivated, both culturally, but of course in everything we do too, as linking back to this Confucian concept. And finally, behaviors, thinking about compassionate leadership. Indeed, Michael Fullan, in I think his most recent work, has talked explicitly about compassionate leadership as something that he strongly believes in. And again, it's something that as international educators is very central to what we do. And again, it very much goes back to this Confucian cultural context. Again, just thinking about ways of displaying this. So the cognitive, the li, the guan, the yi, the ren, the behavioral. Guan, yi, ren, care, righteousness, compassion. The motivational and metacognition. So it's all underpinned by the sense of wanting this cultural understanding and being culturally responsive, by being interested in this cultural knowledge, by developing this cultural knowledge, and ultimately then, the motivational side and the cognitive side all being shown through the lived behaviours which we exhibit as leaders in international schools. And that's about rituals, it's about interactions, it's about formal contexts, informal contexts. As I say, we are all very aware, whatever level we're working at in international schools, of the complexity of the context in which, and indeed the dynamism, I'll come back to that word, and creativity of the context in which we work. So just thinking about, and I might have time to comment on this right at the end, but ways in which, what this means for our staff, ways we can encourage staff to reflect on this. So I've developed, I took the work from Ernie and Ang and just tried to model it more in a Confucian cultural context, with the idea of me going to our leadership team and us thinking about actually what are our synergies with China and with East Asia and with our cultural context, and how can we talk about this both from an expatriate perspective, but also in the work and the conversations we're having with local staff and local leaders. This sense of reflection and dialogue, which I think have to underpin our approaches to leadership in our schools. So the final metaphor, so Paul and Barnell talked about diluting, they talked about decoupling, they then come on to dovetailing, and I really like this as a metaphor, again, thinking about leadership. So they talk about dovetailing, suggesting a more conciliatory approach, and one that attempts to find areas of congruence rather than emphasizing the emergent differences. It's offered in an aspirational sense, not in terms of what is, but rather in terms of what could or what should be. As international educators, obviously it's incredibly important that we are aspirational. Going back to the original goal of international education, which was around promoting peace and sustainability, thinking about ways we can model this sense of aspiration as communities. And I really believe in the sense of international school as bridges between cultures. And on leadership level, the question is, how are we modeling that? How are we demonstrating the reality of that taking place? Equally, talk about dovetailing, I like to talk about reconciliation. International schools as places of reconciliation between cultures, where rather than thinking about otherness and difference, we celebrate commonality, we celebrate diversity, we celebrate collaboration. And again, that's wonderful painting, that's Rembrandt's The Prodigal Son, which I just think captures so wonderfully the sense that the humanity which takes place at those moments of reconciliation, which I believe we should place at the heart of our school communities. So again, coming towards the end, now last few slides. Hartmut Rosa. So I talked earlier about his book on uncontrollability of experience. He also published this wonderful book on resonance. It's a very short book. It's only about 100 pages. It's all about ways in which, as individuals, we're most at peace. This sense of positive well-being, which again I was talking about in assembly this week. It's Mental Health Week here. When we think about ways that we resonate, or we can resonate with the communities and the contexts in which we find ourselves, this sense of experiencing resonance transforms us, and it's this transformation which keeps us alive. I've certainly changed a lot as a person in my 15-20 years in international education. As far as I'm concerned, I've still got a long journey that I'm on in terms of finding my own personal sense of resonance, in terms of finding my own personal sense of ways in which, as an individual, as a leader, I can effectively bridge the different cultural contexts in which I find myself in a way that I guess has this really positive impact on our students, on our school community. And I think it's something that's really captured when we think about this idea of resonance and where we find we resonate, as opposed to dissonance, and where we're finding things that just aren't working. And perhaps we're not listening enough. Perhaps it is about dialogue and conversation, or perhaps there's just something there that fundamentally is a block or a barrier in terms of what we're trying to do. I also really like this, my penultimate slide. This is Sam Strickland. Again, he published this last year, a really nice primer, short book, thinking about leadership. I mean, he's writing about schools in the UK, but I think it's a book that really captures what it is to be a school leader in many diverse different settings. So very, very simple. Thinking about who I am now. Again, this is a useful activity, I think, to do with leaders in a school. Where are we? Where are we now? Thinking about this sense of being culturally responsive. What are our strengths? Where are the gaps? Where are the gaps personally? Where are the gaps in leadership team, in our staffs at school? And being aspirational. Who do we want to be? Where do we want to get to? Perhaps we'll never get there, but I think having that North Star in the distance, and this constant sense of reflection and of growth is incredibly important in terms of ways that we grow and evolve as international school leaders. So finally, really, I've been thinking a lot, I'm sure hopefully it's come across in my presentation, about what it means to be culturally responsive as a leader in international school, particularly in this international school sector, which is very, very different to what it looked like, 20 years ago. So when I first came to Shanghai in 2008, far smaller market of schools, and their main demographic was third culture kids. Well, now I think throughout Asia, the international school sector has exploded. And I think as leaders, that has to affect ways that we think and we conceptualize leadership, particularly in terms of ways that we're thinking about and understanding the complexity of the local cultural context in which we find ourselves. A few thoughts to end, really. So the importance of ethical leadership, this sense of the moral imperative, the sense of ongoing reflection, and as ethical leaders who really do have this cultural intelligence, they really have the empathy to cross and to bridge cultural divides, to create cultures, leadership cultures, school cultures, communities where everyone feels represented, and when you're making decisions for the school that truly do represent the identities, the cultural backgrounds of everyone in that community. A call for a new generation of leader able to be responsive to the needs of the dynamism of the school communities. Certainly reflecting personally on the challenges and the complexity of international school leadership, and thinking about ways that as leaders we respond to that, ways that we grow and we evolve in close partnership with our local colleagues to really create the schools that can be the beacons of of hope, of in the new internationalism of the modern era, I think is really important to us, and I think is a powerful call to action. And of course, the importance of equity, inclusion, and understanding between leaders from all cultural backgrounds as a growing theme. Again, I'm sure this is something that we've all observed as an emerging theme, and something we all care passionately about. In terms of ways we think about and conceptualize the cultures of our schools and our communities. But I think our approaches to leadership have to be at the forefront of ways in which we talk about these terms. Thank you very much. That's it from me. I think, Justin, we've got time for questions if anyone's got anything they want to ask.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Simon. A lot of really thought-provoking content there, and a lot that resonated for me as well, as someone who's kind of worked in the international school space, not in China, but in Hong Kong and around the region for about the same amount of time as you, since about 2008. And I personally went to an international school as well, so I have that experience. And I'm just thinking through your presentation. It's not a question exactly, and you kind of got at it towards the end, but I wonder if you might just reflect a little bit on your personal experience, engaging with international schools and how they've changed from what they were before. And it seems to me there's kind of three periods, and there's the kind of the OG original international schools, which were for foreigners, run by foreigners, and it's kind of like a bubble in wherever they happen to be, and if you were to go to a British school in Nairobi, it'd be really similar to one in Shanghai or what have you, right? Because it's sort of like an island amongst this foreign place. And then there's sort of an era of an international schools where, we're providing an international education for whomever is coming, right? And in that era, it's not really asking much of the foreign teachers, right, to change what their perceptions and attitudes and dispositions are. And in fact, they might congratulate themselves for being very important, that they need to be flown to this other country to deliver what only they can offer, right? Because they're, by definition, they're coming there to do their thing. And now we're kind of in this new era, as you've said, where it's really about bringing together two different modalities, right? Two different cultures, two different ways of teaching and learning. And maybe just reflect on, does that make sense to you as a way of thinking about the kind of journey that international schools have been on, and how has that kind of played itself out in your experience in China over the last 15 years?
Thanks, Justin. Yes, it certainly does play out, I think, in terms of my own perspectives and my own experience of the sector. So just, I guess, to contextualize it, my first job in a kind of fully fledged international school was in South Korea, a school that was relatively new. And I can remember going to that school and kind of thinking to myself in a naive way, why would all these, foreign expat kids want to go to school in South Korea, not realizing, of course, the significant shift in the market to teaching local students. And I think, if anything, this shift has made what we do more complex. So again, I was in Beijing for 5 years, and in a school on a really interesting journey to more of an emphasis on local students and local curriculum, but at the same time trying to make sure that we kept those core values around internationalism, and this sense of being both global and local, and what that looks like. As I think I mentioned, this, maybe I didn't. So in the sense of global, local, but this term "glocal" and "localized," these are terms that I've seen much more in the kind of occurring in the literature, and indeed in the kind of social networking space in the past couple of years, which I think are a reflection of the ways that the sector has changed. But equally, we do have still a significant demographic of third culture kids in our schools, and the challenge therefore becomes both, how can we make sure that we're offering a curriculum broadly defined that is both emphasizing the local values, the local identities of in many cases the majority of our students, but equally we're positioning ourselves so the identities of third culture kids are still affirmed and validated through what's going on in the school community, and they don't, in the words of one of Adam Poole's papers, feel like they're in a Chinese school, when the reality is, they've signed up for an international school and an international curriculum.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting insight. I totally agree. And you've sort of talked a lot about, the kind of new demands that are put upon, leaders in a cross-cultural context, as well as, I guess, that would also extend to educators in a cross-cultural context as well. I wonder, has that changed how, you as a leader approach recruitment, either to bring in new leaders to the organization or teachers?
So I think we're very interested, or I'm certainly very interested in leaders and teachers. Firstly, going back to that sense of motivational CQ, who have that interest in different cultures, who are going to come here and as well as being outstanding practitioners and so on and so forth, have that interest and engagement with our staff. In international schools, there's a divide between expatriate staff and local staff, and we're trying to think creatively about ways of bridging that divide. But certainly having open-minded staff who are really interested in the cultural context in which they find themselves and don't necessarily want to jet off to South Asia or what have you, or Southeast Asia on every holiday, but actually want to spend time in China, getting to know China, getting to know the region. I think that's definitely really, really important. Broadly as well, we've noticed a pattern. Obviously, I was here during COVID. A lot of people, understandably, left China during COVID, but since then we've had a lot of staff who have come back to China, because I think there's a recognition that culturally, it's a fascinating place to live. It's infinitely complex, and there's a lot to learn. And they're the staff who actually are really important to us, because they come in and they have that cultural understanding, which is important. I mean, obviously, if you're teaching a class of kids who may be fluent, speakers of English, but actually outside of school, their home life is essentially Chinese, then there's a lot of cultural knowledge that I think it's really useful for you to have as a teacher in terms of ways you work with those students, and the conversations you're having with parents around tutoring and weekend life and spare time and homework. So yeah, that's definitely something that I think is important.
Yeah. And how can schools support leaders and educators more broadly in terms of professional development, CPD? If you're bringing, a new person in from, say, the UK, or if it's an American school, the US, or whatever it might be, to ensure that they are appropriately prepared to take this challenge on.
I mean, I think starting obviously before they even arrive in the country, alongside all the HR processes, beginning to beginning to find ways at least to get them reflecting upon culturally what they might find challenging when they get here. This sense of culture shock, and trying to minimize that and actually make it something that's exciting rather than something which is worrying or concerning. Obviously, in the inset program, finding opportunities, for them to go on a city trip in Shanghai, say, go to local restaurants, begin to experience the Chinese culture, or indeed the culture in which the school is based and centered, and that being a theme, I suppose, of staff programs around well-being. I mean, in our well-being program, we do a lot around trips in Shanghai and the local community, and trying to get our staff out there and getting to know, seeing a different side of Shanghai, perhaps from the side they would typically see as expatriates. CPD. So from a leadership perspective, we run leadership twilights here for all of our leaders. And a key element of those, I suppose, has been, in fact, we had a session last week on culturally responsive leadership, has been this theme of journeys and stories. And as I was kind of touching upon, I think when we think about being an authentic leader and what it might mean to be an authentic leader, being reflective and sharing our own cultural contexts, our own backgrounds, our own journeys with each other and talking about them is really, really important. And as a core part of that, reflecting on what the connection might be with where we come from, where we've come from and where we are, and how we can celebrate that to make us better at what we do. And equally within the PD, ways in which that we ensure we bridge the relationships between expat staff and local staff. I think it's really important, if you are working in a school where you have a significant number of local students, that you have local staff in important positions in the school, and making sure that those relationships are really strong and worthwhile. And again, by making opportunities for staff to work together, PD's a great opportunity for that. In our PLCs, our professional learning communities, we have, in all of them, we have local staff working with expat staff on projects to try to bridge that divide. And finally, where there's interest in language, putting on some provision. So we have free Chinese language classes for our expat staff, should they be interested, just to try and engage them. As I say, Mandarin is infinitely complex, and the fact my wife, who's Shanghainese, actually speaks Shanghainese most of the time anyway, which I find kind of frustrating, but that's the way it is. Certainly in China, and obviously in Hong Kong, everyone speaks Cantonese. But at least language is a way, and even if it's just learning basic greetings and what have you, I think that's useful and important. And again, it leads to curiosity, and we want kids who are curious. And if we want kids who are curious, we've got to have staff who are curious.
I'm curious. I totally agree with something you said towards the beginning, where you're talking about that a lot of leadership is modeling, right? So how do you modeling the practices you want to see in your school? And I wonder, what are some examples of how leaders can model culturally, responsive practices, such that then trickles down to the staff and everything else?
I think it's important that students see expat staff having interactions with local staff in a way that demonstrates, the power of those cross-cultural understanding. I mean, a classic example as well is teaching assistants. Most of our teaching assistants are from local backgrounds. Most of our primary form tutors are from expats, and thinking about ways in which those staff model collaboration. Again, something that we've been thinking about and talking about a lot here, because especially primary students are incredibly astute, and they pick up all sorts of things you wouldn't have thought they could pick up. But if that model of collaboration is happening in a classroom or indeed across the school on an ongoing basis, I think that's really powerful in terms of ways in which they are modeling that sense of being culturally responsive. And equally, I think being understanding of, having an awareness of ways in which parenting in China perhaps might be different to parenting or in your local context, might be different to parenting in a more westernized context. And in your meetings with parents, being responsive to that, maybe taking more time than you would usually to listen, spending more time on the dialogue, on the communication. Because again, I think ways in which as adults we can model those strong relationships will immediately mean that that will have an impact on students, because they will see ways in which we are constructing those cross-cultural relationships. They will see the success of that, and in turn, that will have an impact on ways that they think about the relationships that they have with their classmates, the behaviours they exhibit in school. And equally, when we think about the lives, I mean, most of our kids will go on and study abroad, whether that's for high school, whether that's for university. They may well go and work and live abroad for the rest of their lives. And understanding how cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural relationships can look and how they can work successfully, I think is really important actually for them, and ways they internalize that and take it forward.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think that whole notion of demonstrating real collaboration as opposed to having the relationships be more transactional or hierarchical or what have you. Because I do think that you're right that students can pick up on that even at the very youngest, maybe even more so at the very youngest age, right? So I think that's a really, really good way of thinking about it. I think we have time for one more question, and I just wanted to ask, we've talked about a little bit the changes that international schools have undertaken, I think particularly in China over the last 15 years. What do you think of the next steps? What are the trends that we're looking towards? Where is this all going, I guess?
So that's a good question, Justin. I'm actually just following my doctor. I'm just writing a book on specifically British schools, international education in the region, and thinking about the future of the sector. I do think that ways in which we kind of localize, we center ourselves locally and globally is incredibly important. This term cosmopolitan nationalism has crept into the literature, which is talking about a sense that within schools, we are both thinking about national identity, but also global identity, particularly in terms of the skills students are developing and in the sense of this global outlook that they're developing as students. And I think that's really important. I mean, in China, it's a very competitive sector, and I think the schools that really survive and thrive will be the schools that focus on this area of culture, that focus on the connections that they have within their school, and also the partnerships they're making outside of their community. Because it's in many ways a very young sector, but it's having to mature very quickly, I think, just because it's become very competitive. Demographic reasons, for regulatory reasons, and the schools that can successfully tackle those challenges will be ones that will be successful. I mean, it's hard to catch exactly what that looks like, because I don't quite know, but my gut instinct is the schools that are in 30, 40, 50 years time really thriving will be the ones that get it right now around these critical areas.
Well, that's a wonderful place to finish. I totally agree. It's a complex environment, but it's the schools that are always learning, always adapting, I guess, right? That will figure these things out and thrive in the future. So thanks again, Simon. I really appreciate the time and sharing all of your information today, and a lot of really good things to think about. So once again, thanks, Simon.
Thanks a lot, Justin. Thank you.
Cheers.